Alien warrior was about to execute the human, until he risked his life to save her from certain death. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Jason would have never expected to find himself in a situation like this. Standing in the heart of a war-torn alien world, he could feel the weight of his fate pressing down on him. His hands were bound, his body bruised and battered from the skirmishes he'd endured while on his mission. But none of that mattered now. In front of him, towering over him with eyes filled with cold fury, was Kira, a fierce alien warrior. Her red skin shimmered under the harsh light of the alien city, her muscles rippling with every movement. She had him cornered, with her blade raised high, ready to strike. Jason knew the end was near. He had faced danger countless times before, but this felt different. This wasn't just another fight for survival. This was about something far more complicated: honor, loyalty, and the choices that would define his future. As Kira raised her weapon, her eyes met his. He could see the hatred in her gaze, the years of conflict and bloodshed that had shaped her into the warrior standing before him. And yet, there was something more, a flicker of uncertainty, a hesitation that made Jason's heart race. He knew what was coming. He had heard the whispers, the tales of how the Xerathi warriors showed no mercy, no compassion. This was their way. Yet, even as the blade gleamed in the alien's hand, Jason couldn't help but wonder, was there a chance for redemption? A chance to prove that humanity had something the aliens lacked? As the seconds stretched out, Jason's mind raced. He knew he had only one option left, one final chance to make a difference. And as Kira's blade began to descend, something inside him snapped. He was no longer just a prisoner. He was a man, willing to risk everything to save not only his life, but the life of the warrior who stood before him. Without thinking, he lunged forward, using every ounce of strength he had left to push Kira out of the way, saving her from the lethal explosion that suddenly rocked the city. Jason's body collided with hers, sending them both tumbling to the ground just as the shockwave slammed through the streets. The blast was deafening, shaking the very foundation of the city. For a moment, everything went black. When Jason came to, he found himself on the ground, his head spinning, but alive. He could feel the heat of the blast on his skin, smell the burnt air, and hear the distant wails of destruction. But most of all, he could feel Kira's presence beside him. She was alive. She was breathing. He had saved her. Jason slowly pushed himself up, his body protesting with each movement. His hands were still bound, and the world around him was a blur of smoke and debris. But he could see Kira now, staring at him with wide eyes, her weapon forgotten at her side. She looked at him not with hatred, but with something else, something he couldn't quite place. "You saved me," she said, her voice low, filled with disbelief. Jason nodded, his chest heaving as he tried to regain his balance. "I wasn't going to let you die," he said simply. Kira didn't respond immediately. She just stared at him, as if trying to process what had just happened. In her world, enemies did not save each other. Yet here was this human, a stranger, a prisoner, who had just risked everything for her life. It didn't make sense. But as the seconds ticked by, something in Kira shifted. Her expression softened, just slightly, as if a crack had formed in the armor she had built around herself. Jason could feel the change in the air between them, the shift from enemy to something else. It was a fragile bond, one forged in the heat of battle, but it was real. And for the first time since landing on this war-torn world, Jason felt hope stir in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to this than survival. There was something deeper at play, something worth fighting for. As the smoke from the explosion began to clear, Jason pushed himself to his feet, his body aching with every movement. His hands were still bound, the ropes cutting into his wrists, but he barely noticed the pain. What mattered now was the alien warrior lying beside him, Kira. She was still unconscious, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Jason knelt beside her, his mind racing as he tried to assess her condition. The blast had knocked them both to the ground, but it had also given him the chance to save her. He hadn't expected it to end like this. He hadn't expected to risk his life for her. But now that he couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. He had saved her life. But would she see it as an act of kindness, or would she see it as weakness? As he gently lifted her into his arms, he felt the weight of her body, her skin still warm despite the cold air. He knew he couldn't stay here for long. The city was in ruins, and the enemy would soon regroup. He had to get her to safety. But where could they go? The thought of running crossed his mind, but he couldn't bring himself to leave the alien warrior behind. No, he had made his choice. He had to protect her, no matter the cost. With his teeth gritted in determination, Jason began to move through the rubble, carrying Kira with surprising ease. His heart was pounding in his chest, and every step felt like a battle in itself. The world around him was a blur of smoke and fire, the sounds of distant gunfire and explosions echoing through the air. But he didn't care. All that mattered was getting her to safety. They moved in silence, Jason's boots crunching against the shattered streets as he navigated through the broken city. Kira's body remained limp in his arms, but he could feel the faintest stir of movement, the brush of her hand against his chest. She was waking up. Slowly, her eyes fluttered open, her gaze unfocused at first, then locking onto his face. Jason's breath caught in his throat as their eyes met. There was a moment of silence, a moment where neither of them spoke, but their gazes said everything. Kira's lips parted as if to say something, but no words came out. Instead, she merely stared at him, her expression a mix of confusion and disbelief. For a moment, Jason wondered if she even knew who he was. After all, he had been nothing more than a prisoner to her just hours ago. But now, things were different. They were no longer enemies. The connection between them had shifted in an instant, and Jason couldn't help but feel the weight of that shift. Why? Kira's voice was weak, barely above a whisper, but it was enough to make Jason's heart race. Why did you save me? Jason paused, his mind struggling to find the right words. There was no easy answer to her question, no simple explanation. He could have lied, could have told her it was a tactical decision or that he had no choice. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was that he didn't want her to die. He couldn't stand the thought of leaving her there, vulnerable and alone. And maybe, just maybe, there was something else. Something that went beyond duty or survival. Because I'm not like you, Jason finally said, his voice rough with emotion. I don't leave people behind, no matter who they are. Kira's expression softened, just slightly, but it was enough to make Jason feel like he had made a difference. She didn't speak for a long time, and Jason didn't push her to. He knew she was processing everything, trying to understand why a human, an enemy, had chosen to save her. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was a moment of understanding, of two beings from different worlds coming to terms with the bond that had been forged in the heat of battle. Jason could feel the shift in the air around them, a subtle change that spoke volumes. The war between their people was far from over, but in that moment, he knew that what had just happened between them was something that couldn't be ignored. It was a new beginning, one that neither of them had expected. As they continued their journey through the city, Jason couldn't help but feel a sense of determination growing within him. He had made his choice. He would protect Kira, no matter what it took. But there was still so much more to do. The battle was far from over, and the future was uncertain. But for the first time since he had crash-landed on this alien world, Jason felt like he had a purpose. And that purpose wasn't just about survival. It was about something much greater, something worth fighting for. As Jason and Kira made their way through the devastated city, the air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and burning debris. The once bustling streets were now silent, save for the distant echoes of collapsing structures and the occasional crackle of fire. Jason's arms ached from carrying Kira, but he couldn't afford to stop. He knew they had to move quickly if they were going to survive. His mind raced as he thought about the next steps, the enemies still lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. But for now, all that mattered was getting her to safety. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. Kira, the warrior who had once been his captor, now relied on him for survival. Jason's thoughts flickered back to their earlier exchange, her quiet question still ringing in his ears. Why did you save me? He hadn't been able to answer her completely then, but as they walked, the truth was becoming clearer. He had acted out of a sense of humanity, of honor, something that seemed to be missing from the conflict surrounding them. The bond between them was fragile, but real. Kira's eyes were now more alert, though still clouded with confusion and exhaustion. She shifted in his arms, her grip on his shoulder tightening as they rounded a corner. She was awake now, her breath steadying as she tried to make sense of the situation. She had been silent for a while, but Jason could feel the tension building. Kira was processing what had just happened, trying to understand why a human had risked everything to save her. "We need to keep moving," Jason said, his voice firm but gentle. Kira nodded slightly, her lips still pressed together in a thin line, as if she were weighing his words carefully. "I know," she said, her voice hoarse. "But where are we going?" Jason hesitated for a moment, glancing around at the ruined landscape. The streets were unfamiliar, and he had no clear destination. But he couldn't stay here. They couldn't afford to be caught. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But we'll find shelter, somewhere safe." Kira looked at him, her sharp gaze flicking over his face, as if searching for something. She had been a soldier her entire life, trained to read people, to understand their motives in an instant. Jason was an enigma to her. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't cold and calculating, driven only by the will to survive at any cost. He had something more. "You're different," she muttered, more to herself than to him. Jason didn't answer. Instead, he continued to move forward, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. The silence between them was thick, charged with unspoken thoughts and emotions. Kira's words lingered in the air, and Jason couldn't help but wonder if she had already figured out what he hadn't fully admitted to himself. That he wasn't just trying to survive. He was trying to do something more. He was trying to make a difference. As they moved deeper into the city, Jason felt the weight of their situation growing heavier. The enemy wasn't far behind, and he knew they wouldn't have much time before they were tracked down. He had to think fast. His mind was still racing, but then he heard it, the faint sound of footsteps behind them. Jason froze, instinctively pulling Kira closer to him as he scanned the street. His heart began to pound in his chest. This was it. They were caught. He could hear the faint hum of alien technology, the unmistakable sound of a hovering vehicle approaching. Jason's mind raced as he quickly analyzed their options. There was nowhere to hide, no cover. The only choice was to keep moving, to outrun whatever was chasing them. But even as he made that decision, he knew it wouldn't be enough. They needed help, and they needed it fast. Without a word, Jason shifted his position, gently setting Kira down on the ground and scanning the street for any sign of escape. He had no idea what would happen next, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going down without a fight. Just as the vehicle rounded the corner, Jason's eyes locked onto something in the distance. A building, partially intact, offering a potential escape route. It was their only chance. "Get ready," he whispered to Kira, his voice low and urgent. "We're running for it." Kira nodded, her expression hardening as she prepared herself for whatever was to come. Together, they sprinted toward the building, Jason's heart racing with each step. The vehicle was closing in fast, its engines humming louder as it approached. But Jason wasn't looking back. He wasn't about to let fear stop him now. They had come too far. They had survived too much. And he was going to keep them alive, no matter what it took. As they reached the building, Jason pulled open the door with a grunt, ushering Kira inside just as the vehicle pulled up to the curb. They were safe, at least for now. Inside, the building was dark, the walls cracked and decaying from years of neglect. But it was shelter, and it was enough. Jason closed the door behind them, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he tried to steady himself. Kira was breathing heavily as well, but there was a spark of something in her eyes. Something new, something he hadn't seen before. "You didn't have to do this," she said quietly, looking at him with a mix of gratitude and confusion. Jason met her gaze, his heart pounding in his chest. "Yes, I did," he replied softly. "I made a promise." The building was silent, its dark and decaying walls closing in around Jason and Kira. The air was thick with dust and the musty scent of forgotten years, but it was a safe haven, at least for now. Jason leaned against the cracked wall, his breath still heavy from their escape, and took a moment to let the adrenaline ebb away. His hands, though still bound, didn't seem as important as they had before. All that mattered now was the immediate safety of both himself and Kira. He glanced over at her, noting the way she was breathing heavily, still trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Kira was strong. He could see that in the way she carried herself, even in these trying circumstances. But there was something different about her now, a vulnerability that Jason hadn't seen before. It wasn't just the physical injury she'd endured. There was something deeper, something she was struggling to comprehend. Kira hadn't spoken much since their mad dash for cover. Her gaze had been distant, her thoughts seemingly far away. Jason wasn't sure if it was the trauma of the blast or the strange bond that had formed between them, but he knew that her silence meant she was processing something. Maybe she was trying to reconcile the fact that he, a human, a prisoner, had saved her life, someone who had been set to execute him only hours earlier. Jason stood up slowly, his muscles aching as he moved toward the window. He peered through the shattered glass, his eyes scanning the streets below for any signs of danger. The city outside was a wasteland, ravaged by the war, and yet, for the first time, Jason didn't feel the weight of hopelessness that usually accompanied such destruction. It was strange, but with Kira beside him, with the bond they had just formed, there was a flicker of something else in his chest. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. He turned back to Kira, who was now sitting on a broken chair, her head bowed slightly, her eyes unfocused. Her usual stern, battle-hardened demeanor had faded, replaced with something softer. Jason approached her cautiously, not wanting to break the fragile silence between them. "You doing all right?" he asked quietly, his voice gentle. Kira looked up at him, her sharp blue eyes meeting his, and for a moment, there was something almost human in them. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice rough. "I don't know what to think anymore." Jason nodded, understanding more than she could know. "I get that," he said softly. "But we're alive. That's what matters right now. We've got time to figure out the rest." Kira didn't respond immediately, her eyes scanning the room as if she were weighing his words. It wasn't just about survival for her, Jason realized. It was about something deeper, something that had been buried under the weight of battle and bloodshed. She had spent her life in a world where enemies were enemies, and there was no room for compassion, no room for weakness. Yet here she was, with a human, an enemy, who had risked his life for hers. It was a concept she hadn't been prepared for. Jason could see the struggle in her eyes, the conflicting emotions battling for dominance. She had been taught that survival came first, that duty to her people was paramount. Yet, in the span of just a few hours, her world had been turned upside down. "Why did you do it?" Kira asked, her voice low, as if she were afraid to ask the question. Jason turned back to face her fully, his expression serious. "Because I couldn't just leave you to die," he said. Simply. "No one deserves that. Not even enemies." Kira's gaze softened just slightly, and for the first time, Jason saw a flicker of something. Maybe respect, maybe understanding. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They sat there in silence for a few moments, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. But despite the dangers still looming over them, despite the uncertainty of what would come next, there was an undeniable shift in the air. They weren't enemies anymore, not in the way they had been. There was something unspoken between them, a fragile understanding that connected them in a way Jason couldn't quite explain. Kira had been a soldier her entire life, trained to follow orders, to kill without hesitation. But now, here she was, relying on someone she once saw as nothing more than a threat. Jason had known fear in his life, had seen the worst humanity had to offer. But in this moment, facing Kira, he realized that fear didn't control him anymore. It was something else. It was about something worth fighting for. "You're different," Kira said quietly, her eyes never leaving him. Jason frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," Kira muttered. "I just thought you'd be like the others. But you're not. You're not like them." Jason shook his head, not fully understanding what she meant. "I'm just a guy trying to survive," he said. "Trying to make it through this mess." Kira didn't respond, but the faintest hint of a smile tugged at the corner of her lips. It was a small thing, a tiny crack in the wall she had built around herself, but it was there. For the first time, Jason felt like they might have a chance at something beyond just survival. He had saved her life, and now, maybe, she was beginning to see that there was more to humanity than she had been taught. "We'll get through this," Jason said firmly, his eyes locking onto hers. Together, Kira's gaze softened further, and she nodded slowly. She wasn't ready to fully accept it yet, But for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe in that possibility. Together, and as the first rays of light began to filter through the cracks in the building, Jason felt something stir inside him. Something that had been lost, buried beneath the chaos of war. Something that made him believe in the impossible. The days that followed were a blur of silence and uncertainty. Jason and Kira stayed hidden in the dilapidated building, their refuge from the chaos of the outside world. Jason had managed to find some basic supplies, old rations, water, and a few scraps of medical supplies, but it wasn't enough. They were still trapped, surrounded by a city in ruins, and the enemy was always just a step behind. Jason couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. It had been 3 days since the explosion, 3 days since he had risked everything to save Kira, and yet, despite the growing connection between them, there was still so much left unsaid. Kira had barely spoken since that night, her thoughts seemingly distant. Jason had tried to engage her, to break through the walls she had built, but she was as guarded as ever. He couldn't help but wonder if she was starting to regret his decision to save her, if she still saw him as an enemy beneath it all. Yet, every time their eyes met, there was something unspoken between them, something that kept him going. They were both survivors, yes, but they were also something more. Slowly, Kira began to move around more, testing her injured body as she adjusted to the new reality they shared. The pain was still there, a constant reminder of what had happened, but she was strong. Jason could see that, even in the way she carried herself despite her injuries. Her resilience was something he admired, something he didn't think he'd ever see in the warrior who had once stood over him with a weapon raised high. One morning, as the sun began to rise over the broken city, Kira spoke. Her voice was low, almost hesitant, but it was the first time she had spoken to him like this in days. "Why did you do it?" she asked, looking at him from across the room. Jason paused, unsure of how to answer at first. It wasn't the same question she had asked before, but it carried the same weight. It was as if she were searching for something, something she couldn't find on her own. "Do what?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Save me," she replied, her gaze steady. "Why risk your life for someone like me?" Jason stood up slowly, feeling the weight of her question settle on his shoulders. He had known this moment would come, but he hadn't expected it to feel so heavy. He had thought that by saving her, he could somehow make a difference. But now, standing in front of her, he realized that the answer wasn't as simple as he had once believed. "Because you're more than just a soldier," he said finally, his voice steady despite the turbulence inside. "You're more than just the enemy. You're a person, and that's something I can't ignore." Kira was silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed on him as if trying to understand the meaning behind his words. Finally, she spoke again, her voice soft but full of emotion. "I don't know how to feel about this," she admitted. "I've spent my whole life fighting, killing, and now I'm not sure who I am anymore." Jason nodded, understanding more than she knew. "I get it," he said quietly. "We're both lost in this war. But that doesn't mean we have to be defined by it." Kira looked away, her expression hardening for a moment before she turned back to him. "I don't know how to trust you," she said bluntly, the walls around her rising once more. "I don't know if I ever will." Jason didn't respond right away. Instead, he stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "Trust isn't something you give all at once," he said quietly. "It's something you build, piece by piece." Kira's eyes softened, just a little, but she didn't speak. Jason reached for her, gently brushing his hand against her arm. "We're not enemies anymore," he said, his voice low but sincere. "We're just two people trying to survive." Kira didn't pull away, but she didn't move closer either. She just stood there, as if weighing his words, as if deciding whether to believe them. Jason didn't know what would happen next, but in that moment, he realized that he was willing to do whatever it took to help her see the truth of it. They weren't enemies. They had more in common than either of them could have ever imagined. But first, they had to survive the next battle. The silence stretched on, but there was something different now. Something in the air between them had shifted. It wasn't friendship, not yet, and it wasn't trust, at least not fully. But it was a beginning, and that was enough. For now, it had to be. Outside, the city was quiet, eerily still, but Jason knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. They would have to move on soon, and when that time came, they would have to rely on each other. For better or for worse, their fates were now tied together. And Jason, for the first time since he had crash-landed on this alien world, felt like he wasn't alone anymore. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The tension between Jason and Kira had been thick for days, but now, as they moved out of their temporary shelter, there was a sense of quiet understanding between them. They had spent their time preparing for what lay ahead, going over the essentials, water, food, basic medical supplies, and securing whatever they could find. The outside world had not become any less dangerous. The city still lay in ruins, its streets littered with the remnants of their once thriving civilization, but it no longer seemed as oppressive. Perhaps it was the strange camaraderie that had developed between them, the shared understanding that they were now allies in a fight for survival, or perhaps it was something else. Jason glanced over at Kira, who was walking beside him, her sharp eyes scanning their surroundings with a soldier's instinct. She had been quieter than usual, lost in thought, but there was a subtle shift in her demeanor. For the first time, she wasn't just focused on the battle ahead. She was thinking about the future. "You sure you're ready for this?" Jason asked, his voice low, breaking the silence. Kira didn't look at him immediately. She just kept walking, her strides purposeful as always. But after a moment, she nodded. "Ready as I'll ever be," she replied, her voice steady. Jason couldn't help but notice the weariness in her tone. She had seen too much, endured too much in this war, and now, when it seemed like the world had broken into 1,000 pieces, she was trying to pick up the shattered remnants of herself. He understood. He was trying to do the same thing. But it was hard, and he knew it wouldn't be easy for either of them. "We'll make it through this," Jason said, more to reassure himself than Kira. She didn't answer right away, but after a few seconds, she gave him a small glance, just a flicker of something in her eyes. "I hope so," she muttered, before turning her gaze back to the road ahead. The day passed in a haze of movement and urgency. They kept to the shadows, avoiding the main streets, sticking to the alleyways and side paths where the chances of being seen were slimmer. The sound of distant gunfire and explosions still echoed through the air, a reminder that the war was far from over. But Jason didn't focus on that. He focused on getting them out, on surviving. They had to find a way out of this city, and soon. The tension between them ebbed and flowed like the shifting tides, but it wasn't just the physical threat that had changed things. There was something deeper, something more personal that was starting to shift between them. He couldn't explain it, but he could feel it. Kira had been quiet for a long time, but now, as they crouched behind an old barricade, she spoke again. "What happens if we get out of here?" she asked, her voice hesitant, like she wasn't sure if she even wanted the answer. Jason paused, his hand resting on the edge of the barricade as he considered her question. It was a simple one, but it carried weight. They had been so focused on survival, on getting through the next few hours, that neither of them had truly considered what came next. He looked over at her, meeting her gaze for the first time in a while. "I don't know," he admitted. "But whatever happens, we'll face it together." Kira didn't respond, but her expression softened slightly, and for a brief moment, Jason saw something he hadn't expected, a flicker of hope in her eyes. It was fleeting, but it was there, like a spark in the dark. They were both standing on the edge of something unknown, something terrifying, but it didn't matter. They weren't alone anymore. And in that moment, that was enough. As night began to fall, they finally reached the edge of the city. The distant glow of firelight flickered in the distance, and the sounds of battle had quieted for the time being. It was a small relief, but it was enough to let them know they had made it. For now, Jason didn't stop to celebrate. There was no time for that. They were still vulnerable, still exposed, but they had made it this far. And that was all that mattered. Kira glanced at him, her eyes serious again. "Where to now?" she asked, her voice steady. Jason looked ahead, his mind already working, already planning the next move. "We get out of the city," he said, "and we figure it out from there." Kira nodded, and they began walking again, side by side, as the stars above them began to shine brighter in the sky. For the first time since they had met, Jason felt like there was a chance for something beyond just surviving. They didn't have a plan yet, but they had each other. And sometimes, that was enough to make all the difference. The night was quiet, the only sounds the soft rustling of the wind and the distant crackle of fire from the ruined city behind them. Jason and Kira had made it past the city's edge, and now, as they moved through the barren landscape, The weight of their situation was beginning to sink in. They were no longer running from immediate danger, but the world around them still held many threats, unseen, waiting to strike at any moment. Kira walked beside Jason, her eyes scanning the horizon, alert as ever, but there was something different in her movements now. She wasn't as tense, not as guarded as before. It was as if the weight of their shared struggle had created an unspoken bond between them. Jason didn't know exactly when it had happened, but somewhere along the way, they had gone from enemies to reluctant allies, and now to something more. He didn't know what that something more was, but it felt real, and that was enough for him. As they continued walking through the moonlit wasteland, Jason's thoughts wandered. He thought about home, about Earth, about what he had left behind. He thought about his family, his friends, if they were even still alive, if they had survived the war. He had been a soldier, part of a larger mission, but now, everything felt different. Now, it was just him and Kira, trying to survive, trying to make it through the next day. He looked over at her, noticing the way she moved, the grace with which she navigated the desolate landscape. She was a warrior, strong and unyielding, but there was a quiet strength in her that he hadn't seen before. It wasn't the cold, detached strength of a soldier. It was something more. It was the strength of someone who had been through unimaginable hardship, but still chose to move forward. "We're almost there," Jason said, breaking the silence, his voice low. Kira didn't answer, but her eyes flicked to him, her expression unreadable. She had grown more comfortable with the silence between them over the past few days, but Jason knew that it didn't mean everything was settled. She was still processing everything that had happened, still trying to reconcile the fact that she had been saved by the very person she had once viewed as an enemy. Jason could understand that. He was still trying to make sense of it himself. "What happens when we get to the safe zone?" Kira asked after a long pause, her voice softer than usual. Jason paused, unsure of how to answer. They had talked about escaping the city, but he hadn't thought much beyond that. There were rumors of safe zones, places where survivors could find refuge, but Jason didn't know how true those rumors were. For all he knew, they could be walking straight into another trap. "We'll figure it out when we get there," Jason said finally, not wanting to give her false hope, but not wanting to admit how uncertain everything truly was. Kira didn't respond, but she nodded, her jaw set in determination. The silence between them was comfortable now, a steady rhythm as they walked side by side through the cold, empty night. The further they traveled, the more the weight of the world seemed to lift, though they both knew that danger was never far behind. The safe zone, if it existed, was still miles away, and the closer they got to it, the more Jason's mind raced. They had no idea what they would find when they arrived. They could be walking straight into another war zone, or they could find sanctuary. But in that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was that they were still alive, still moving forward. After several hours of walking, they reached a small clearing, a brief moment of respite in the vast, empty land. Jason stopped, finally allowing himself to catch his breath. He could see the exhaustion in Kira's face, the way her shoulders sagged under the weight of their journey. She wasn't invincible, no matter how much she seemed to want to believe that. "Let's rest for a bit," Jason suggested. Kira hesitated, her gaze flicking to the horizon, but then she nodded, lowering herself to the ground. Jason did the same, sitting down beside her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they simply sat in silence, the weight of the day settling between them. The stars above were clear, their light cold and distant, but it was a reminder that they were still part of something bigger, still connected to the universe, despite the chaos around them. Kira glanced at him, her face softening just slightly. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. Jason turned to her, surprised by the sincerity in her tone. "For what?" he asked. Kira shrugged, looking away for a moment before meeting his gaze again. "For saving me," she said simply. "For not leaving me to die." Jason didn't know what to say. The words seemed too small for the moment, too inadequate for the weight of what she was offering. Instead, he simply nodded, his voice low when he spoke. "We're in this together," he said, and this time, it felt true. Kira didn't respond, but there was something in her eyes that spoke volumes. A quiet understanding, a shift in the dynamic between them. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something. And that something felt like a new beginning, one they would have to navigate together. As the night stretched on, the world around them felt quieter, the chaos of their past fading into the distance. There was still so much uncertainty ahead, so much they didn't know, but for the first time in a long time, Jason felt like there was a chance for something more than just survival, a chance for hope. The morning light was weak, the sun barely visible through the thick clouds that hung low in the sky, casting everything in a dull, gray hue. Jason and Kira had slept little, their eyes always alert, scanning the vast wasteland for any signs of movement. They had resumed their journey at first light, knowing they couldn't afford to rest too long. The world around them was silent, but they knew that silence didn't mean safety. The battle was far from over. As they trekked through the barren terrain, Jason felt the weight of their situation settling deeper in his chest. He kept his focus on the path ahead, his thoughts a mix of caution and hope. The safe zone they were heading for was still miles away, and they had no guarantee of what they would find when they got there. Would it be a place of refuge, or would it be another trap set by the enemy? He didn't know, but they had to try. How much further? Kira asked, her voice hoarse, but steady. Jason glanced at her, seeing the fatigue in her eyes. She hadn't said much since their conversation the night before, but he could feel the change in her, the shift that had taken place since they had begun to work together. She was no longer just the enemy, no longer just the warrior who had once held his life in her hands. She was a person now, someone he was fighting alongside, and maybe, just maybe, someone he could trust. A few more hours, maybe less, Jason said, though he wasn't sure. He couldn't give her any false hope, but they had made good progress. They just needed to keep moving. They couldn't stop. "We'll make it," Kira muttered, almost to herself, her eyes focused on the distant horizon. Jason nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead, calculating their next steps. The sun was rising higher now, the faintest warmth creeping through the clouds, but it wasn't enough to dispel the cold that seemed to settle in his bones. The landscape around them was desolate, nothing but cracked earth and scattered remnants of destroyed buildings. There were no signs of life here, no civilization, just the aftermath of a war that had torn everything apart. The silence was overwhelming. "Do you think we'll find it?" Kira asked suddenly, her voice breaking through his thoughts. Jason turned to look at her, his brow furrowing in confusion. "The safe zone," she clarified, her gaze steady. "Do you think it's real?" Jason hesitated. He wanted to tell her that they would find it, that everything would be okay once they got there, but he couldn't bring himself to lie. "I hope so," he said finally. "But we don't know for sure." Kira nodded, her jaw tightening slightly. "I've seen things like this before. Safe zones. Places that are supposed to protect you. But they're never what they say they are. They're either full of people desperate enough to do anything to survive, or they're abandoned, left to rot." Her words carried a weight, a bitterness that Jason hadn't expected. He had seen the destruction, the chaos, but hearing her speak so openly about it made him realize just how much she had endured. She wasn't just a soldier. She was a survivor. And in that moment, Jason realized just how little he truly understood about her. They had been so focused on getting through each day, on surviving, that they hadn't stopped to truly listen to each other. "You've seen safe zones like that?" Jason asked quietly, his voice laced with concern. Kira's eyes flicked to him, her expression unreadable for a moment before she nodded. "I've seen it all," she said simply. "The lies, the betrayals, the people who say they'll protect you, only to turn their backs when things get tough. I don't know what we'll find at the safe zone, but I'm not expecting a miracle." Jason didn't know what to say to that. He didn't know what it was like to have lived through the things she had. He hadn't seen the things she had seen, but he could understand the fear, the doubt. They were in this together, and the uncertainty of what they were walking into was something they would both have to face. "We'll make it through," Jason said again, though this time, it didn't feel like a promise. It was more of a hope, a wish he couldn't shake. Kira didn't respond, but she looked at him for a long moment, her gaze softening. Maybe she didn't believe in miracles, but she was starting to believe in something else, something that didn't rely on promises or false hope. She was starting to believe in them, in what they could accomplish together. The hours passed slowly, the landscape stretching on forever, but the closer they got to their destination, the more Jason felt a sense of resolve building within him. They couldn't stop now. They had come too far. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the broken land. Jason and Kira finally reached the edge of a small valley, where a series of makeshift structures stood against the fading light. Jason stopped, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. The safe zone? Or just another false hope? He couldn't say, but it didn't matter. They were here now, and they would face whatever came next together. As Jason and Kira approached the makeshift structures, their hearts raced with a mixture of anticipation and caution. The buildings were small, seemingly abandoned, but there was a flicker of movement in the distance, shadows that seemed to belong to people, not just the wind. Jason's instincts immediately went on alert. He stopped just outside the edge of the valley, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of danger. Kira stood next to him, her posture tense, her eyes flicking between the buildings and the horizon. She didn't speak, but Jason could tell she was thinking the same thing. Was this a safe zone, or another trap? They had both seen too much to trust easily, but something told Jason they had no other choice now. They were too close. They had come too far to turn back. Slowly, they began to move forward, each step careful, calculated. Jason kept his hand close to the weapon at his side, ready for anything. The closer they got to the structures, the more it became apparent that the place wasn't entirely abandoned. There were signs of life, small fires burning in the distance, the faint sound of voices carried on the wind. Jason's heart sank as he realized they weren't alone. As they reached the first building, a figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the firelight. The figure was tall, with broad shoulders, and wore the uniform of someone in charge. Jason's first thought was that they were walking straight into enemy hands, but then the figure spoke. "You're the first to arrive in weeks." The voice was gravelly, yet there was a hint of relief in it. Jason and Kira stopped, exchanging a quick look. They were close enough now to see the man more clearly. He had graying hair and a weathered face, but his eyes were sharp, full of experience. He wasn't a soldier, but there was something about him that spoke of survival. "Who are you?" Jason asked, his voice cautious, but not hostile. The man stepped forward, lowering his weapon slightly. "Name's Marcus," he said, his gaze shifting to Kira. "And you must be the ones we've been hearing about." Jason tensed at the mention of hearing about. "What do you mean?" Kira asked, her tone wary. Marcus's eyes flicked between the two of them before he answered. "We've been trying to rebuild, trying to create a safe zone here, but it's been tough. Not many of us made it out of the city. We've been hearing rumors of a human and a Xerath warrior working together." Kira stiffened at the mention of her people's name, but Jason could see that Marcus wasn't hostile, just curious, trying to make sense of the situation. "You've heard of us?" Jason asked, keeping his tone neutral. Marcus nodded slowly. "We've heard of a lot of things," he said, his voice softening. "But you're the first ones to make it out of the city in months. I don't know how you did it, but if you've come this far, then maybe we still have a shot." Jason's mind raced, trying to piece together what this meant. They had arrived at what seemed to be a haven, but the questions still lingered. Were these people truly allies, or would they turn on them as soon as the opportunity arose? Kira was silent, her eyes narrowing as she sized up Marcus. She had been through too much to take anything at face value, and Jason didn't blame her. But in that moment, something shifted in him. The exhaustion, the fear, the doubt, it all seemed to fade away. The hope, however fragile, that had been stirring inside him now felt more real than ever. "So what's the deal here?" Kira finally spoke, her voice firm but controlled. Marcus seemed to consider her words for a moment before answering. "We're just trying to survive," he said. "We've got food, shelter, a place to regroup. But it's not much. We're not an army. We're not heroes. We're just people trying to rebuild after everything was lost." Jason could hear the weariness in his voice, the weight of it in the air. It wasn't much, but it was something that hadn't been there before. They were standing at the edge of a new beginning, a place where they could rest, recover, and plan. Jason looked over at Kira, who met his gaze. There was a quiet understanding between them, something unspoken. This wasn't the end of the journey, not by a long shot. They still had battles ahead, still had obstacles to face, but for the first time in a long time, Jason felt like they had a fighting chance. Kira nodded slowly, as if making a decision. "We'll stay," she said, her voice steady. "For now." Marcus's expression softened into a faint smile. "Good," he said. "We could use more people like you." Jason felt a small weight lift from his chest. They had made it. They weren't alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, they would be able to rebuild, to find a way forward. The road ahead was uncertain, but they had each other, and that was enough for now. As the stars above them began to shine through the fading light, Jason couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. They had survived, they had found a place to rest, and for the first time since he had crash-landed on this alien world, he felt like they had a chance to rebuild, together.